Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Jen, and I'm a board member of Women in Politics. So Women in Politics has launched the 2020 hashtag Ask Her campaign as a part of an effort to encourage women to consider running for office in an upcoming election at any level of government. So this campaign's primary goal is to support all women who would like to become involved with politics by sharing the experiences, perspectives, and advice of other women who have been in their shoes. So our interviews, which will be shared online and cataloged as podcasts, will feature women who have previously run for office at various levels of government. We will hear from women who have previously served in public office, from current elected officials, and women who ran in the past. All will offer their advice and experience to help inspire other women to enter the race. Above all, we want to achieve the goal of having more women's voices at the decision-making table. So today I'd like to welcome Suze Morrison, who is the NDP MPP for Toronto Centre. So first of all, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a privilege.
Oh, it's exciting. So I think we'll just get started with tell me what made you decide to run?
Yeah, so as some folks may know, I actually have quite a long history with women in politics in London. So I grew up in my riding of Toronto Centre. I've lived here almost all of my life, but we also lived in London, Ontario for a handful of years while my husband was doing his PhD at Western, and was part of the founding group of board members for Women in Politics in London. So the work that you're doing is so close to my heart. And so I would say, my earlier interest in politics is connected to the work of Women in Politics. And, in London, I started volunteering on municipal election campaigns, started to get involved in more, grassroots community organizing initiatives. I got to sit on an advisory committee at City Hall. The kind of opportunities that, I think would have been really hard for someone as young as I was at the time to have had those opportunities in, any other major city in Canada. But, London has this this special ability to be, just big enough to have such amazing opportunities, but still have that smaller town, feel at the same time. So I was really grateful for those opportunities. So after my involvement with Women in Politics, I was really politically engaged, but we moved back home to Toronto Centre, back into the same community that I grew up in. And I was working at a nonprofit at the time, and starting to get involved in community organizing and with my riding association. And the decision to run was in some ways sudden. I'll be honest. There were, two things that happened back to back that I really kind of attribute to being the tipping point for me to make the decision to actually to put my name on the ballot for the first time. And it's not a fun or an easy story to tell, but in the summer of 2017, my husband and I were witness to a drive-by shooting in Regent Park, just around the corner from our apartment. And we're first on scene and performed CPR on a young man, Lamar Champagne, who died later that night in hospital. And it was an incredibly traumatic moment for us. And 2 days later, Pam McConnell passed away. And Pam McConnell was our progressive city councillor at the time, representing the area. She'd long been a champion for Regent Park, a champion against poverty, a champion for housing for women, and it broke my heart to lose her voice at city council. And I was terrified in that moment of, as I was simultaneously kind of processing the trauma of the experience that we had been through, and knowing how closely connected the issues of, gun violence and poverty were that we were dealing with. Mm-hmm. And I was just absolutely terrified in that moment of having, a disconnected, rich white dude in a suit from Bay Street who didn't understand what we were going through in our community, who didn't have the lived experiences, who, you know, couldn't make those connections between, you know, the safety issues that we were experiencing, and, you know, the upstream root causes of violence and poverty. And I was just so afraid we were going to lose Pam's really strong progressive voice. So at the same time that all of those things were going on, Kristen Wong Tam, another really great progressive city councillor, who's now come to represent the area, of course, now that the wards were amalgamated under the really anti-democratic Bill 5 that meddled in Toronto's municipal elections in the middle of an election, thanks to Doug Ford. But at the time, she had started a municipal campaign school, Women Win TO, and folks had started sending me links to this application. And the week before, you know, I was laughing at them. I said, you know, why would I have a great city councilor. I have Pam McConnell. Why would I ever go and do this? I am represented by the best of the best. And then a week later, my perspective on that shifted, and folks kept sending me the link to this campaign school. And so I applied and I got into the program and I had a fantastic experience. We had some amazing women in that cohort. You know, I was there with Jill Andrew, who's come into the legislature with me, as well as folks like Kiara Padavani, who's still running for a municipal seat. She wasn't successful in the last municipal campaign, but I believe she's planning to run again, or at least I hope so. And you know, built really great relationships, learned a lot. And you know, as I was going through that process, you know, I still in my head was thinking I was going to be, you know, trying to throw my hat in the race municipally. And then a few folks from the riding association sort of started tapping me on the shoulder saying, look, we've got a provincial election coming up. Have you thought about running in the nomination? So I was like, sure, why not? And, you know, thinking in my head, you know, knowing how many times it takes to run to be successful as a first-time candidate and how much I had to learn about campaigning. You know, in my head, I thought, okay, great, I'll go run in a contested nomination against other people that, you know, are way more qualified and they're going to win the nomination, but I'm going to learn how a nomination works. And then I'm going to work on the campaign and help get them elected. And in my head, the probability of going from that decision to actually being a candidate in a provincial election to actually being elected, you know, the likelihood of those successive things happening was basically zero. And, you know, was really quite shocked at every step along the way when I all of a sudden found myself in Queen's Park, and it was like I had spun around and I wasn't quite sure how I got there. But you know, I don't regret it for a second. It's been a bit of a wild ride, but you know, it's really interesting to me how you know, quickly your willingness to say yes can change. Right? Like it was, I was an absolute no until the moment that I wasn't. And so it's just, I think it's amazing how quickly your perspective on the situation can change. And, you know, all of the different moments in your life that culminate to setting you on a specific path, you know?
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And it's interesting because when I hear you say, like, you laughed, you thought it was funny, right? When people suggested you run. And I mean, you know, I remember being 20 and you know, my colleagues saying, you should run to be a union rep. You're so smart and mouthy. And it's like, you know, but you're like, ha ha, you know, who, me? Like, I wouldn't, with, like you said, like with all these qualified people, right? So that's really amazing. I wanted to circle back and ask you, what is a riding association?
Yeah, so riding associations are bodies that exist provincially and federally, right. That are local local bodies that represent the different political parties in your specific riding. So in Toronto Centre, you know, there's a riding association for every party, and it's how we organize ourselves. And so if folks are interested in getting more involved in partisan politics, and, you know, I really, you know, the biggest advice I can give to young people is figure out, don't be afraid of partisanship. I don't see neutrality, political neutrality, as something to be, upheld as the most, virtuous thing. Have values, have beliefs, and put yourself out there and stand on them. I always think about, sorry, I'm digressing. I always think about Alexander Hamilton, my favorite musical, and Aaron Burr, who's always criticized for, if you stand for nothing, Burr, what will you fall for? And so I really always encourage, particularly young folks, do the work to unpack your values, figure out which party
Right.
resonates with you,
Okay.
and don't be afraid to get involved, and get involved early, because there's so much learning that you can do along
Mm-hmm.
the way. But riding associations are the local bodies that represent a party in a riding. And there's really great volunteer opportunities that you can do with those organizations.
Mm-hmm.
You can run for an executive position, and take on a responsibility of work within the riding association, whether that's, managing the budget, doing fundraising, doing voter outreach, organizing events. There's no shortage of work to be done. And even if you don't want to take on that level of commitment, you can come out and volunteer. And especially if you have an elected official that's in that riding, the whole work of the riding association becomes to support that elected official, get them reelected, or to support the candidate, and identify candidates, do candidate search. And so we're always, in need of volunteers, whether we're out knocking on doors between elections, hosting events, doing fundraising. There's no shortage of work. So get involved with your riding associations. Once you've done the work of figuring out, if you want to be a party member in our party system. And there's, I think, a lot of value to knowing, who you are and where you stand on a political spectrum, and not being afraid to, be brave and bold about those beliefs and those values, and where you stand.
That's great. Thank you. That's really great. So when you were running, what was the biggest hurdle that you had to overcome? Actually, sorry, I want to circle back. What was the biggest hurdle you had to overcome to run?
Yeah, to run. I would say the biggest hurdle was the nomination itself,
Okay.
which was contested. And so what a lot of folks don't know is that, provincially and federally, you're actually running 2 elections to become a candidate, right? In most circumstances. There's some cases that are different. Some parties have internal rules that allow them to appoint candidates to a riding. But in most cases, most ridings go through what's called a nomination process. Most parties in most ridings. And so you're basically campaigning to just the membership, to be selected as the name that the members of that political party in that riding are going to put on the ballot, who they want to back. And so when I ran for the nomination, I was one of 3 candidates, and I was the underdog. I was the scrappy underdog, and vying against 2 people that I totally love and adore.
Mhm.
And to this day have great relationships with, and are huge supporters I can always count on. And I was in it more to learn how to run a nomination. And the organizing experience that I learned was invaluable. But I would say, in terms of barriers, I felt like, as the only woman in the race,
Mhm.
I was nervous about, was I going to be taken as seriously as these
Mhm.
2 men who were much more, had been around a lot longer than I had. One of them had run as a candidate before, one was a political staffer
Mhm.
formerly, and they had the kind of, connections and experience that I just didn't. And that made me nervous. But also, financially, and it put me in an awkward position at work when I expressed my interest in running for a nomination. And once I won the nomination, I then immediately had to go on a leave of absence. And having not uh, anticipated actually winning the nomination and that being an outcome, I don't know that I had fully thought out the financial implications of what I
Okay.
had signed myself up for,
Right.
right? And so it was, my husband had just finished his PhD. He was working on a postdoc. We
Okay.
still both have student loans. And so, as a younger woman, to make that commitment and have to take, more than 2 months off work, unpaid to do that campaigning work, and then at the same time to have to be tapping into my network to do fundraising, financially was terrifying. And if I hadn't won, probably would have been months and years, digging myself out of that. And I think that that's, something that scares a lot of people out of running for elected office. And it's the most unfortunate part, because it's the folks that are, the young people with student debt, and the single moms, and the folks working precarious work, who understand the gaps and the fault lines in our systems so deeply, because they've lived it, and they understand where policy fails. Folks in the margins, and folks that are living in poverty, or folks that are living precariously, or underemployed, precariously employed. And those voices, we've never needed those voices more, but it's
Yeah.
becoming, I think, harder and harder for those voices to get a foot in the game, because the economic risk that you put yourself at as a candidate is not small. And a lot of folks don't, I think, realize when people put their names forward, the amount of their personal lives that get put on hold, or put on pause completely, right? It was a really difficult task to undertake, and like I said, I don't regret it for a second. But the financial component was definitely a challenge.
Okay. Yeah, that's huge, like you said, for a lot of people, and the people who need to be at these decision-making tables the most.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So tell me about, well, now that we know that you had such a short time span between the decision and running, but tell me about your expectations of running versus like what it was really like.
Yeah. I think my expectation of what the inside of a campaign actually felt like as a candidate was a lot more glamorous than it actually was. I think we like to think that it's, what we see on TV, right? It's all the sexy stuff. It's,
Oh yeah.
Doing debate prep and debates and media hits, and, spending hours poring over policy and decision making. And the real truth of it is, the work that you do with your riding association, your party, in the 2 years leading up to a campaign, is when all of that policy work gets baked in and settled on, so that we're not making policy on the fly in a campaign, right? So the first thing that you take off of your to-do list is really actually any policy work. As a party, as a collective group of folks, you're engaging in that work year round, and in the 4 years and the 2 years, especially leading up to the campaign. And you're making those platform commitments. And then we're just releasing them kind of throughout the campaign to get folks excited, and to let them know, where we stand on all of these issues. So that's the first thing that you take off your to-do list, off your shoulders as a candidate. The next thing that comes off your shoulders, particularly if you're in a media-dense downtown Toronto market, is the idea that you are going to get any media coverage on your campaign. Unless you're running a by-election, or where you're the only candidate for miles around, or you're in a smaller media market where, like in London, where the local paper, will pick up more coverage of, when you've only got 2 or 3 ridings, and 2 or 3 close races that you're watching, you might get a little more attention there. In Toronto, I think I maybe did, 3 media interviews the whole campaign. So take that off your shoulders as a task you think you're going to have to do. And then, the debates, actually, start to become, once you start to get into a good rhythm in a campaign, the debates actually start being one of the least useful things you can do as a candidate. And it sounds weird to say, I know, because and I do them and I love doing them, because folks have a right to see how their candidates can think on their feet and respond to their policy and how well they know the policy that they're standing on. But the real work that you do as a candidate is nothing but knocking on doors and making phone calls. Your job is to connect with as many voters as possible and convince them why you're the person for the job, right? And answer any questions that they have, and then be, an available, engaging person. Debates where, so I'll be out knocking on doors from 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night. And if I'm not knocking on doors, I'm on the phone asking for money. Those are the only two things you do. You eat and sleep canvassing and fundraising. And you don't do a lot of eating and sleeping. But
No.
and you don't. But the debates are, they look really sexy on TV, but in person, you might end up spending 3 hours in a room with 20 people that are already decided voters before they walk in the room, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not there to change anyone's mind. Everyone there is to support the team, the team that they're there on behalf of, to cheer you on. And so it's a fun, engaging thing to do, and an important part of the democratic process. But in that same 3 hours, if I had been out knocking on doors, I could have connected with, probably 100 different voters, and have helped people make up their mind about, where they stand on election day. And so the value in terms of actually the number of people you can engage with, is at the doors. It's at the doors. And it's scary, when you're right after I was nominated and I got sent out on my first canvass, I was like, oh my God, I have to do what? I have to go knock on people's doors and ask them for my vote and ask them for their vote. But you start to love it after a while. It's actually, it's a lot of fun. You get to have really great conversations with people, and you get the wildest stories, from canvassing. Like just the wildest stuff will happen, when you're out at the doors. But that's what the job is. It's definitely none of the sexy stuff, or very small amounts of the sexy stuff that we see in the movies.
Thanks, Suze. So I just have one last question for you. Thinking back to the Suze going into thinking about running during your time running, if you could say something to that Suze, or any woman or girl like you, what would you say?
I would tell her to start volunteering on campaigns earlier and more often. I wish I'd had the opportunity to work on more campaigns than I did. I think that the experience is invaluable. And to anyone who's thinking about running, the best advice I can give you is to go and volunteer on a campaign and be a sponge. And be the hardest worker that campaign has ever seen. Learn how to understand your party's policy, and then learn how to message it, how to communicate it to people in different places in their lives. Right? Like, learn how to take your health policy and make it understandable to young parents versus seniors versus students. Right? Like understand the nuances of communicating your policy. Get good at knocking on doors, so that you're not nervous and afraid to talk to voters, because it's all you're going to do. Volunteer to fundraise for your riding association. Get on the phones and start asking for money. It's ridiculously hard to do, and every bit of practice you can get doing it will help. The relationships that you'll build working on those campaigns and putting in those hours, is the thing that you'll need, particularly if you're going to run at a provincial or federal level, to secure the support of the people that are the members of that riding association, who are the folks that are going to need to nominate you, if that's the level of government that you want to run at. And also recognizing that, municipally, while municipal politics exists outside of the partisan structure, you'd be, I think, misguided to think that those same folks that are so politically active and engaged at provincial and federal levels at the Riding Association aren't also involved municipally as well, right? And the networks of connections that those people have into those municipal campaigns is deep and massive. So go volunteer so you can build those relationships, gain the skills, and lay the groundwork so that you've got a good foundation under you when you do decide to put your name forward.
Thank you. So just to close, I just want to again offer our thanks for coming back to Women in Politics, for being your founding member, right? So for starting Women in Politics and for coming back to us in your position today. We're so appreciative.
Oh, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.